In just 5 minutes, a powerful judge tried to shut Karoline Leavitt down with a $15,000 fine. No hearing, no facts, no warning. Just raw power, swung like a hammer. But what that judge didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was that Karoline Leavitt wasn't the kind of woman you corner. He thought he was silencing a voice. Instead, he lit the fuse on a courtroom confrontation that would bring his own authority to the edge of collapse. What began as a quiet procedural hearing erupted into a full-blown reckoning, a clash between unchecked authority and unshakable truth. Can a young woman with nothing but the law, precedent, and unwavering resolve dismantle a judge's entire illusion of control? Stay with us. Because what happened in courtroom 4B wasn't just a hearing. It was the beginning of a legal uprising. It was supposed to be routine. Just a 10-minute check-in on procedural matters, the kind of thing most attorneys breeze through between phone calls and coffee refills. Nothing major, no fireworks, no surprises. But as Karoline Leavitt stepped through the tall double doors of courtroom 4B, the air hit her differently, cold, sterile, and unwelcoming. It was the kind of chill that didn't come from the weather, but from something deeper, something scripted. The courthouse, a towering structure of concrete and indifference, sat in the middle of downtown like a forgotten relic of power. The kind that still believed robes could silence reason and procedure could bury the truth. But Karoline didn't walk in like a woman expecting to beg for fairness. She walked in like a woman who already knew where this was headed. Inside, the courtroom was unusually quiet. Not calm, quiet, like the pause before an avalanche. The clerk barely made eye contact. The bailiff's face was unreadable. Even the court reporter, always the most mechanically focused in the room, looked unsettled, fingers resting on the keys but not moving. Karoline could feel it. The energy was off. Something had already been decided before she'd even arrived. Then came the moment that told her everything she needed to know. Judge Alan Barrett was already seated. Not just seated, enthroned. His robe draped perfectly over the high-backed chair, his gavel polished and placed just so. He didn't glance up when she walked in. Didn't offer the customary nod. No greeting, no sign of protocol, just silence. It wasn't the silence of contemplation. It was the silence of choreography. Everyone in that room already knew their part, except Karoline. But she wasn't there to play a role. She was there to speak. And that's exactly what Judge Barrett didn't want. She took her place at the defense table, setting down her folder with quiet precision. Her suit was sharp, her posture straight. She wasn't just prepared, she was armed, and the judge could sense it. He glanced up for only a second before speaking. His voice cut through the room like an order, not a sentence. "This court has reviewed the matter under Municipal Code 48B2, he said flatly. "The violation stands. The fine is $15,000. Payment is due immediately." No explanation. No reading of the docket. No acknowledgement of the opposing counsel, who, for what it was worth, looked just as confused as Karoline felt. No arguments. No evidence. Just a verdict, dropped like a stone in water. Karoline didn't move. Her file was still closed, her lips pressed into a thin line, the only visible sign of pressure. But behind her stillness, her mind was already in motion. Quick, clear, ruthless. Not with emotion, but with focus. Across the room, the prosecutor shifted in his chair, furrowing his brow. He wasn't in on this. That much was obvious. Even he looked like he'd missed a critical email. Because there hadn't been one. Because this wasn't procedure. This was punishment. Not for a violation, but for presence. For defiance. for walking into the courtroom without fear and daring to expect fairness. Judge Barrett didn't look at Karoline like an attorney. He looked at her like a problem to be removed, a disturbance in the order he had curated over years on the bench, an order he believed no one had the right to challenge, especially not her. But he had miscalculated, because what he saw as confidence, Karoline had built out of necessity, not arrogance, survival. She had learned early that the courtroom wasn't always about justice. Sometimes it was about who could stare longer without blinking. So she stood, not quickly, not with fury, but with the calm of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to say. "Your Honor," she began, her voice even, controlled. "With all respect, we haven't begun. No evidence has been presented, no hearing conducted. I haven't had the opportunity to speak." Barrett's head tilted slightly, not out of confusion, but condescension. His mouth curled at the edges. "No hearing is necessary when the matter is clear," he said. "You're out of order." Karoline didn't sit. She didn't flinch, and she didn't raise her voice. She simply adjusted the angle of her stance, placing both hands on the table in front of her like someone preparing for impact. What she saw in the judge's eyes wasn't certainty. It was fear. Not of being wrong, but of being questioned. Of having someone in his courtroom who didn't fold the second the robe spoke. Karoline knew in that moment that this wasn't about legal codes or minor violations. It wasn't about 48b2. It was about control. He wanted to make an example out of her, to remind everyone watching that the law bends to the bench, not the other way around. And maybe that would have worked, if the person standing in front of him hadn't come with something far more dangerous than defiance. She came with the law, and she was just getting started. The silence in the courtroom wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unnatural, heavy, orchestrated. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot or precedes a disaster. Karoline stood there, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. But make no mistake, this wasn't shock, it was calculation. Because Judge Barrett hadn't just issued a ruling. He'd skipped the process entirely. No docket summary, no witness list, no reading of rights. He hadn't even asked if both sides were present. He had walked in, sat down, and fired off a $15,000 penalty like he was ordering lunch. No discussion, no warning. The courtroom felt like a trap, and she had just sprung it by breathing. Barrett didn't wait for her response. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming softly on the bench like he was already moving on. Like her objections, her presence, her entire argument didn't matter, as if they never had. "This matter is not open for debate," he said, barely glancing in her direction. "You were served notice. The fine is entered into record. Next case." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was the tone of a man used to compliance, the tone of someone who believed authority was its own justification. Karoline didn't move. She didn't blink. She simply narrowed her gaze and spoke. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she said, "there is no next case until this one is heard. Due process isn't a courtesy, it's a right." Barrett's eyes finally met hers, and what she saw wasn't surprise. It was irritation. The same kind of irritation someone feels when their schedule is interrupted. When a machine, perfectly calibrated to run without resistance, suddenly stalls. "I said the matter is closed," he replied, sharper this time. "You may file an appeal if you're unsatisfied." Unsatisfied. That's what he called a surprise $15,000 fine based on nothing. No report, no documentation, just one man's word, issued from behind a desk higher than everyone else in the room. Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words struck with precision. "An appeal of what, Your Honor?" A verdict rendered with no evidence, no hearing, no chance to respond? The courtroom remained frozen. Even the prosecutor, whose job it was to oppose her, didn't speak. His pen hovered above his legal pad, mid-sentence, never landing. The clerk's eyes flicked up, then down again. The gallery, a scattered group of observers and law clerks, held its collective breath. Barrett's face didn't move, but the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth gave him away. He was used to people nodding, accepting, moving on. Karoline had just done the opposite. He leaned forward. This court is empowered to issue fines under Municipal Code 48B2 without formal hearing when the evidence is deemed sufficient by the officer of record. If you have a problem with the code, take it up with the city council. Until then, you'll respect the authority of this bench. Karoline's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not challenging the code," she said calmly. "I'm challenging your interpretation of it. And the Constitution is very clear on what qualifies as sufficient evidence. Personal opinion isn't one of them." That landed. Barrett's hand stilled. The fingers stopped tapping. For the first time since she entered the room, he looked at her like a threat. Not to his ruling, but to his order. His control. Because what Karoline had done wasn't just challenge the verdict. She had cracked the foundation beneath it. And the sound of that fracture was deafening. Across the courtroom, the tension tightened. The kind that made people shift in their seats without realizing it. Because everyone watching now understood. This wasn't about a fine. This was about power. Who had it? Who could question it? And who dared to? Karoline stepped forward, not physically, but rhetorically. "You've issued a penalty of $15,000, she said. "On record, without documents, without testimony, without letting me say a single word before declaring guilt. That's not oversight. That's autocracy." Barrett's jaw clenched. His gavel remained untouched, his authority now caught between reaction and retreat. And for the first time, he paused, just long enough for everyone in that courtroom to recognize what he didn't want to admit. Karoline wasn't there to ask for permission. She was there to expose the truth, and Judge Barrett had just handed her the stage. The pause that followed Karoline's last words wasn't silence. It was a vacuum. Everything in the room felt pulled into it. The breath of the gallery, the eyes of the clerk, even the judge's own rhythm. For a second, the courtroom stopped pretending. This wasn't about enforcement. It never had been. Judge Barrett shifted in his chair, but it wasn't a move of confidence. It was the adjustment of a man who had expected the show to be over, only to find the spotlight still burning. His lips parted, as if to speak, but he closed them again. There was nothing to say that didn't confirm what everyone already knew. He had ruled without process, without evidence, without even the pretense of listening. Karoline could feel it now, the tension morphing into something else. Not just discomfort, but awareness. The kind that spreads through a room like heat. The prosecutor was no longer scribbling notes. His pen rested on the table, untouched. Even the gallery, scattered citizens, young attorneys, a few curious passers-by, had grown still, their attention locked not on the bench, but on the woman standing before it. Karoline didn't press forward. She didn't need to. The power was already shifting. All she had to do was hold the line. "I'd like to see the documentation," she said, voice crisp, deliberate. "Any photos, reports, affidavits, anything that substantiates the claim behind this fine." Barrett exhaled sharply through his nose, the kind of sound judges make when they're used to being obeyed, not questioned. "This is not discovery, Miss Leavitt," he snapped. "The citation is entered. The court accepts the officer's statement as valid. That is sufficient." "Sufficient for whom?" she asked, eyes narrowing. For justice? Or for convenience? Barrett's eyes flicked toward the court reporter, then back to Karoline. He wasn't answering her, not because he didn't have words, but because he didn't have ground. There was no documentation, no visual record, no corroborating witness. The officer in question wasn't even present. And still, he had ruled. $15,000. That's what it cost to walk into Judge Barrett's courtroom unafraid. Karoline turned toward the gallery now, not grandstanding, but anchoring herself, making it clear that her fight wasn't about defiance. It was about exposure, about dragging something rotten into the light where everyone could finally see it. This fine, she said, gesturing toward the bench without looking at it, is built on nothing. No facts, no data, no report. Just the word of a man who isn't here, rubber-stamped by a judge who won't explain the decision. Barrett's jaw clenched. His fingers twitched once atop the bench, then stilled. Karoline kept going. Justice demands evidence, she said. Not assumption. Due process is not a technicality. It is the foundation. If that foundation crumbles, so does everything built on top of it. A murmur rippled through the back row. Soft, quick, like breath catching in lungs. Barrett heard it too. And that's when the panic began to flicker behind his eyes. Because now it wasn't just Karoline who saw the cracks. The room saw them. She was no longer alone. Miss Leavitt, Barrett said, his tone colder now, sharper. This courtroom is not a forum for your political speeches. Then stop acting like a politician, she shot back, not raising her voice but sharpening it. You ruled without process. You levied a fine without proof. And now that someone is challenging you, you're hiding behind the robe. The room stilled again, stunned by the bluntness. And yet, no objection came. Not from the prosecutor, not from the clerk, not from the bench. Because it was true. Karoline reached down, slowly, and opened her folder. The sound of the metal clasp echoed in the stillness like a countdown. Municipal Code 48B2, she said, placing a sheet on the table, requires citation enforcement to be backed by either physical documentation or a sworn report. Neither exists in this case. There is no compliance officer statement on record, no time-stamped visual, no audit trail. She looked up, eyes locked on Barrett. You didn't rule on evidence, Your Honor. You ruled on absence. Barrett didn't speak, because she was right. He hadn't made a judgment. He had made a move, one that relied on fear, not law. And now, for the first time in a very long time, it wasn't working. Karoline didn't smile. She didn't smirk. Her face remained calm, steady, almost solemn. Because she knew. This wasn't just a $15,000 fine. This was the moment the mask slipped. And the courtroom saw who the judge really served. Karoline had laid it bare. Facts, precedent, process. And yet Judge Barrett sat motionless, staring at her as though none of it had registered. As though she hadn't just peeled back the hollow underpinnings of his ruling with the grace of a surgeon and the force of a wrecking ball. He wasn't stunned. He was seething. But not the kind of anger born from legal disagreement. No, this was different. This was personal. The kind of rage that builds when a system rigged on silence is suddenly met with a voice that won't bend. And Barrett, for all his years on the bench, had only one response left: humiliation. He leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, his hands folded like a man preparing to deliver a eulogy. His voice came low, almost calm, but it was laced with something sharper than contempt: control. Miss Leavitt, he said, his words crisp, slicing through the still air. This is not your stage. This is a courtroom, not a campaign rally. If you intend to grandstand, I will have no choice but to hold you in contempt." He let that word sit, full and dangerous. Contempt. It wasn't just a threat. It was a warning, one designed to break her in front of everyone. Karoline didn't blink. He thought he was cornering her, putting her in her place with the full weight of institutional power. But Karoline wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for every person who had ever been steamrolled by procedure masquerading as justice. And she knew the difference between law and performance. Barrett didn't stop. "You are not entitled," he continued, louder now, voice rising with the kind of performative disdain meant for an audience, "to disrupt proceedings with unfounded accusations. Your tone, your defiance, your demeanor, it all borders on a violation of courtroom decorum." He was trying to paint her as unstable, as emotional, as someone out of control. It wasn't about the law anymore. It was about spectacle. He wanted her to flinch, to falter, to give him that one moment, one raised voice, one sharp gesture, so he could gavel her into silence and say to the room, "See, I told you she was trouble." But Karoline didn't raise her voice. She didn't even shift her weight. Instead, she let the silence grow, let it stretch out into something unbearable, something undeniable. And in that stillness, the gallery could feel it, the tremor in Barrett's performance, the desperation behind his authority. Because power doesn't yell unless it's scared of losing. Karoline spoke finally, and her voice was like glass, clear, smooth, and unbreakable. "Your Honor," she said, her tone razor-edged but calm, "invoking contempt against an attorney for citing precedent and requesting evidence is not enforcement. It is retaliation." The room froze. And just like that, Barrett's attempt to shame her flipped on itself. What was meant to put her down had only raised the stakes. She wasn't just resisting a judge now, she was defining the very abuse in real time. The prosecutor shifted in his seat again, uneasy. The clerk glanced up for just a second too long. Even the gallery, once passive, now felt pulled into something much larger than a procedural hearing. They were watching a game that was no longer about law, it was about dominance, and Karoline refused to be dominated. But Barrett wasn't finished. His tone changed, feigning restraint. "If you feel you've been mistreated, Miss Leavitt, I suggest you file a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Board. But in this courtroom, you will abide by the rules of order. This is not about your feelings." Karoline's expression didn't move. "That's exactly right," she replied. "This isn't about feelings. It's about the Constitution. And if courtroom order means accepting punishment without proof, then we're not enforcing the law. We're performing it." Barrett stared at her, but he didn't respond. Because there was nothing to say that didn't prove her point. She had held her ground, unshaken, unintimidated. And with every word, she had transformed what was supposed to be a public scolding into a public indictment of his methods, of his posture, of a system that feeds on obedience disguised as respect. Barrett had tried to humiliate her, tried to strip her of power in front of a crowd. But Karoline hadn't just resisted the blow, she'd turned it into evidence. And the courtroom was watching. Barrett's attempt to bury her under the weight of courtroom authority had failed. Not spectacularly, but precisely. Because what Karoline did next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even defensive. It was surgical. She didn't flinch or shout or plead. She simply stood, slowly, deliberately. Not with the speed of defiance, but the steadiness of someone who knew she belonged exactly where she was. No unnecessary movements, no wasted breath. Just presence. A presence that filled the courtroom in a way that robes and titles never could. Her hands, which had rested calmly on the defense table, moved only to gather the edges of her folder, as if she were adjusting the weight of something she'd carried 1,000 times. Inside, her pulse might have been pounding, but no one would know it. Because Karoline Leavitt had learned long ago that in rooms like this, stillness was power. And now she was wielding it. Barrett watched her rise like a man watching a fuse get lit, and realizing too late that it led to his own throne. "Your Honor," she began, and her voice didn't boom, but it cut. Clean, precise. "The record will show that I have not disrupted this court. I have not spoken out of turn. I have not challenged procedure. I have only asked to be heard." She paused, not to build tension, but to let the silence swallow the truth of that statement. And it did. The air around her tightened. Barrett opened his mouth, but no words came out. Because what was he going to say? That she was wrong? The prosecutor shifted again. The court reporter finally resumed typing, her fingers moving faster now, as if something in the room had shifted from routine to history. Karoline could feel it too. This wasn't just a defense. This was a moment, the kind that couldn't be undone once spoken. "I have cited no less than 3 binding appellate decisions," she continued, voice steady, each reinforcing the necessity of evidence before penalties are imposed. "I've asked, repeatedly, for the documentation that justifies this fine. To date, none has been presented, not by the prosecution, not by the issuing officer, not by this court." Her tone never changed, not once. But with every word, the ground under Barrett's bench began to erode, because she wasn't yelling, she wasn't flailing, she wasn't losing control. She was displaying it. "Due process," Karoline said, eyes locked forward, "is not a matter of mood. It is not a luxury to be granted or withheld depending on the defendant. It is a right, fundamental, constitutional. And this court," her eyes narrowed just slightly, the only sign of temperature rising beneath her skin, "this court has chosen to ignore it." The gallery didn't move. The clerk froze mid-note. Even the bailiff, trained to remain expressionless, stared straight ahead, visibly holding his breath. Barrett shifted back, just slightly. He wasn't losing his grip because she challenged him. He was losing it because she was unshakable while doing it. Karoline let the silence stretch for a beat longer before continuing. "This is not a performance," she said, voice soft now. "This is a plea, for the law to mean what it says, for this courtroom to be a place of adjudication, not assumption. Because if we start deciding cases based on convenience, without facts, without records, then what are we really preserving here?" Barrett didn't answer. Because he couldn't. Because she had just voiced the question that the courtroom had avoided for too long. And now it echoed. Her final words landed not like an argument, but a verdict of their own. "This fine, entered without evidence, without testimony, without process, is not just unjust. It is unconstitutional, and I will not let it stand. Not because I am defiant, but because I believe this courtroom still belongs to the law, not the man behind the bench." She sat slowly, deliberately, the same way she had stood. Calm, composed, in control. The only sound in the room was the whisper of her chair brushing against the floor. And in that moment, every person in courtroom 4B understood the truth Judge Barrett had spent a career avoiding. Power could intimidate, but it couldn't compete with clarity. Karoline's words had settled into the walls like a tremor that didn't stop. Not a single voice dared to rise after she sat. The air didn't shift. The gallery didn't fidget. It was the kind of silence that wasn't passive. It was stunned. Not because someone had spoken, but because someone had reminded the room what speaking was supposed to mean. Judge Barrett sat stone-faced behind the bench, his lips pressed so tight the corners of his mouth nearly vanished. His robe, which had carried so much weight just moments earlier, now seemed to hang looser on his shoulders. The gavel sat untouched beside him, a symbol of authority he hadn't dared to raise. Not yet. Because now, every eye in that courtroom wasn't just watching him, they were measuring him, waiting to see if he would respond to the law or recoil from it. Karoline didn't break her focus. She wasn't waiting for him to find his footing again. She was already moving forward, her voice rising not in volume, but in significance. "Due process," she said again, this time slower, as if forcing the words to penetrate the ceremonial wood of the bench itself, "is not something this court gets to ration. It is not granted by permission. It is guaranteed by principle." Barrett inhaled through his nose, then exhaled as if managing anger. But the control he thought he had walked in with was slipping. Beneath his silence, behind the facade, he was stalling. Because Karoline hadn't just cited law, she had demanded it. And she wasn't asking for her voice to be heard. She was asserting that it must be. Across the aisle, the prosecutor leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, hands clasped tightly, eyes no longer on Karoline, but on the judge. Because even he knew, whatever this hearing had started as, it was no longer a matter of fines. It was a matter of precedent, a matter of accountability. Karoline stood again, this time without hesitation. "Let the record reflect," she said, voice clear as glass, "that I am making a formal motion for this court to provide, on the record, the evidence used to justify the $15,000 fine levied under Municipal Code 48B-2. Her tone was flawless, measured, legal, ironclad. "I am requesting," she continued, "any visual documentation, sworn officer statements, timestamps, inspection records, or corroborating materials used in the issuance of that fine." Barrett's knuckles whitened slightly as he gripped the edge of the bench. He had ruled without evidence because he hadn't expected to need any. The power of the robe, the deference of the room, that was supposed to be enough. But Karoline hadn't just refused to kneel. She had demanded substance, and there was none. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. A beat passed, then another, and then finally, he reached for something. Anything. "This court," he began slowly, carefully, "has discretion to weigh the credibility of enforcement officers and rule accordingly." Karoline was ready. "Discretion does not mean immunity," she snapped, her words crisp and sharp. "And it does not allow this court to act in the absence of evidence. That is not discretion. That is authoritarianism wearing procedural makeup." A few gasps rose from the gallery. Small, almost inaudible, but real. And Barrett heard them. She wasn't just holding the line now, she was pulling others with her. "I'm not here for theatrics," Karoline said, her voice softer now but somehow more dangerous. "I'm here because what happened in this courtroom today isn't just irregular. It's unconstitutional. And if it can happen to me, if a $15,000 penalty can be dropped on someone with no chance to respond, no record of evidence, and no witness testimony, then it can happen to anyone." She turned briefly toward the gallery. "To any person sitting here right now, any business owner, any parent, any citizen who doesn't happen to fit neatly into the framework of what this court finds acceptable." Barrett's jaw tightened. His hand twitched toward the gavel but froze just short of touching it, because deep down, he knew. Karoline wasn't disrupting the court. She was reminding it of what it was supposed to be. She turned back toward the bench, her voice now low and exact. "I demand to be heard, not as a courtesy, but as a constitutional right." And with that, the silence returned. Not as suppression, but as respect. Not from fear, but from awakening. Because Karoline had done something no gavel could silence. She had made the courtroom remember itself. The moment Karoline finished speaking, the room felt like it had inhaled, but refused to exhale. Everything sat on edge, the clerk's fingers hovering over the keys, the gallery stunned into stillness, the bailiff unmoving by the door like a statue that had suddenly become aware of its surroundings. Judge Barrett didn't respond right away. Not because he was weighing her words, but because he was measuring something else. The room, the optics, his control, and the terrifying realization that it was slipping through his fingers like sand. Karoline had done more than speak. She had demanded, not emotionally, not theatrically, but with a precision that made his authority look brittle. He didn't like that. So he did what men like him often do when cornered by someone who refuses to be small. He doubled down. Barrett leaned forward, slowly, the way a predator does when it's about to pounce, not because it's hungry, but because it's afraid. His voice came low but firm, too calm to be sincere. "Miss Leavitt," he said, each syllable coated with disdain, "we're not here to indulge in grandstanding. If you're interested in presenting legal theater, I suggest you take it somewhere else. This courtroom doesn't exist for your performance." The word lingered. Performance. He said it like a slap, meant to belittle, to recast everything she'd just done as spectacle, to erase her credibility in one clean swing of tone. But Karoline didn't flinch, because that's what he was counting on. An emotional crack, a sharp reaction, a misstep he could grab and twist until the room forgot why she was speaking in the first place. Instead, she stood even straighter. Her face didn't harden. Her tone didn't spike. It softened, but not in submission, in control. "No, Your Honor," she said, voice almost quiet now. "This isn't theater." Then she paused, just long enough for everyone to feel it. "This is war." The words didn't ring out. They dropped, heavy, measured, final, measured. And Barrett blinked. Just once. But everyone saw it. The prosecutor, the gallery, even the court officer. Because Karoline hadn't come to entertain. She had come to dismantle. Barrett leaned back, but the damage was done. He had swung first, called her a performer, tried to shove her voice into the margins of irrelevance. But his contempt didn't land as an insult. It landed as evidence. Proof that what Karoline had been saying from the beginning was true. This wasn't about the violation. It was about silencing. She took a step forward, not grandly, not theatrically, just enough to change the energy. "I didn't come here to perform, Your Honor," she said. "I came here prepared." Barrett's jaw clenched. "I came with legal precedent. I came with a folder full of case law, municipal regulations, and constitutional backing. I came ready to defend myself. And instead of allowing that defense, you tried to reframe it as showmanship." Her voice never wavered. "That's not law," she continued. "That's projection. It's an attempt to diminish argument by labeling it dramatic. But what's actually dramatic is this court's decision to issue a 5-figure fine based on zero documentation." The gallery stirred, softly. A cough, a whisper, the rustle of someone shifting in their seat. But no one left. No one looked away. Because they weren't watching a show. They were witnessing a reckoning. Barrett picked up his gavel, but didn't bring it down. He held it, as if the weight of it might return what he'd lost. "I will not tolerate this tone," he said finally, voice sharp. "You are dangerously close to contempt." Karoline didn't step back. "I'm already in contempt," she said, her tone even, steady, "of a system that mistakes silence for respect and calls accountability an attack." For a moment, Barrett didn't move, because now he had to make a decision. Double down again and risk breaking the room, or retreat in silence and admit the grip was gone. But Karoline had already made the choice for him. She had turned his insult into a declaration, his contempt into a confession. This wasn't performance, it was strategy. This wasn't courtroom theater. It was a fight for the soul of the bench. And Karoline Leavitt wasn't acting. She was winning. The gavel never dropped. Barrett held it, fingers wrapped tight around the handle like it might still mean something. But he didn't strike. He didn't speak. He just sat there, perched behind a bench that had once commanded the room, now reduced to furniture behind a silence he couldn't control. Karoline didn't need the pause to collect herself. She didn't need the moment to think. She'd already done the work, long before she stepped foot into this courtroom. And now, with the judge cornered and the gallery watching, she opened her folder. Not with a flourish, with finality. "This court has ruled on assumption," she said, laying the first sheet down flat on the table. "So let's talk precedent." Barrett didn't move, but something in his posture shifted. A subtle tension in his shoulders, the kind that creeps in when a man realizes the rules are about to be read back to him, not with emotion, with law. "Sullivan v. State of Illinois, 2017, Karoline began, her tone methodical. "A local enforcement officer issued a $10,000 fine for a code violation. No photos, no inspection report, no corroborating witness. The appellate court reversed the decision." She lifted the page, held it just high enough to command the bench's attention. In its ruling, the court stated, "Due process is not satisfied by the presence of authority alone. Evidence, not assertion, must ground enforcement." A ripple of stillness ran through the room again. This wasn't a performance. This was procedure, being wielded the way it was always meant to be, like a scalpel. Karoline laid down the second sheet. "Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg, 2019. Another fine, this time $12,500, issued solely on an officer's verbal claim. The city defended the practice as common protocol. The court disagreed." She looked directly at Barrett. In the opinion, the judge wrote, "Administrative decisions must be based on demonstrable fact. Without evidentiary support, they are void under constitutional review." Still no response from the bench, just the soft click of her folder's metal rings. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't plead. She didn't gesture. Her hands moved only to flip the next page. "Thomas v. Newton County, 2020. A man fined $6,800 based on an alleged zoning infraction. The ticketing officer provided no physical documentation, just a handwritten citation. The appellate court called the ruling arbitrary and in violation of the 14th Amendment." She paused just long enough for the weight of the words to land. Not for drama, for clarity. "Your Honor, this isn't theory. These are published decisions, binding in scope, clear in message." Karoline stepped away from the table now, not pacing, not performing, just advancing. Municipal authority is not exempt from due process. Fines levied without evidence are not enforceable. Enforcement must be supported, not simply asserted. Barrett's fingers twitched again on the gavel. But still he didn't use it. Because to silence her now would be to declare for everyone watching that the facts didn't matter. And even he wasn't ready to wear that robe in public. Karoline returned to her place behind the table. Her voice softened, but every word was still a strike. "3 cases," she said. 3 reversals, all based on one simple truth. Power cannot replace proof. The gallery didn't move. The prosecutor didn't speak. Even the clerk, whose fingers had finally resumed typing, now looked up between keystrokes, eyes narrowing like she too was starting to understand that something bigger was unfolding here. Karoline closed the folder. "That's the precedent," she said. "And unless this court is prepared to ignore binding case law, constitutional review, and its own ethical mandate, there is no legal foundation for this fine to stand." Her hands rested calmly atop the folder now. She wasn't just prepared. She was finished. Not a single word wasted. Not a single sentence unanchored. Barrett sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But his silence said enough. She hadn't appealed to emotion. She hadn't played to sympathy. She had brought the law into the room and let it do exactly what it was built to do. She reminded the court of its purpose. And now, the judge who tried to rule from above was left with no ground beneath him. The folder was shut, but its contents still echoed. Karoline didn't speak. She didn't need to anymore. The pages she laid out on the table might as well have been steel. They were unbendable, clear, immutable. She had invoked the law like a commandment, and now the room was left to reckon with it. And that's when it began. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable. The court reporter, who had earlier stopped typing altogether during the judge's outburst, resumed with slow, deliberate keystrokes, not out of habit. Not because the court had instructed her to, but because something in her gut told her, this part matters. The clerk at the side table looked up, not with the blank expression she'd worn since the session started, but with a flicker of something almost resembling doubt. Her eyes drifted toward the judge, then to Karoline, then down again, this time with her pen actually moving across the ledger. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, previously postured in indifference, shifted again. This time it wasn't nerves, it was calculation. His hands moved off the table, fingers pressing together in a slow rhythm, as if retracing every word Karoline had just delivered. You could see it in his posture. He wasn't thinking about how to counter her. He was trying to figure out how he'd ended up on the wrong side of a moment he didn't see coming. And in the gallery, the stillness broke. Just slightly. Someone in the third row leaned forward, elbows resting on their knees. A man in a gray blazer, probably an intern or a young clerk in training, took out a notebook and began scribbling. Not courtroom procedure, but details, quotes, names. He knew what this was now. Not a hearing. A shift. Barrett noticed. Of course he did. He had commanded this room too long not to recognize when it was slipping away from him. And make no mistake, he felt it, even if he didn't show it. His fingers still gripped the gavel, but not like a weapon now. More like an anchor, something to hold on to before the tide pulled him under. Karoline remained silent, poised, present. Every inch of her posture was deliberate, unshaken. She didn't glance toward the gallery. She didn't let her eyes wander. Her focus remained pinned to the bench, not out of reverence, but because that's where the fire still burned. Barrett may have been the only one left pretending the courtroom was still his. But Karoline? She had taken the floor, and she wasn't letting it go until truth had finished its sentence. "You've made your argument," Barrett said at last, his voice flat, brittle, not commanding, just present. Karoline responded with nothing but a nod. And again, the silence returned. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the hush of a room being held down. It was the breath before. The kind that comes before a wave hits shore. The kind that tells everyone watching. Something irreversible is about to happen. The court officer, who hadn't moved a muscle since the session began, adjusted his stance slightly. Not in alarm, but in acknowledgement. He wasn't protecting the bench anymore. He was watching it, judging it. The weight of centuries of decorum, hierarchy, and deference didn't feel so automatic now. It felt conditional. And Barrett, perhaps for the first time in that courtroom, understood that his authority wasn't absolute. It was rented, and the lease was running out. He glanced toward the prosecutor, a subtle tilt of his head, a silent invitation. Say something, push back, reclaim the room. But the prosecutor only blinked and said nothing. Because what could he say? Karoline hadn't thrown accusations. She hadn't grandstanded. She had cited law, precise, binding, and irrefutable. Her voice hadn't cracked. Her posture hadn't shifted. And the documents in her folder were not opinion. They were precedent. She had placed them on the table like evidence in a criminal trial. And now they sat there, heavy with consequence. Because if this courtroom ignored them, it wouldn't just be ignoring Karoline. It would be ignoring the law. And that, more than anything else, was what was starting to creep into the room. Not admiration, not applause. Doubt. The kind that infects from the inside. The kind that cracks the foundation of even the most immovable institution. And Karoline could feel it. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. But she stood just a little taller. Not because she had landed a blow, but because the courtroom had finally opened its eyes. For the first time since she walked in, it wasn't her who looked like the outsider. It was the judge. And now, in that strange vacuum of power and silence, the next move wasn't his to make. It was hers. Barrett's silence stretched longer than it should have. Long enough that everyone in the room knew exactly what it was. Not a pause for consideration, but a stall for control. His grip on the gavel remained tight, like he was willing it to mean more than it did. But meaning had already left the bench and gathered at the defense table, where Karoline stood with the unshakable calm of someone who knew she had already won the argument, even if the ruling hadn't caught up to her yet. The judge leaned back, his robe folding like a curtain closing on an act he hadn't planned to end this way. The courtroom wasn't responding to him anymore, not with attention, not with deference. The weight of authority had shifted, inch by inch, from his platform to her posture. Karoline didn't need permission to continue. The room had already given it to her. She stepped toward the stand, not in defiance but in precision, and addressed the one figure the court had failed to truly see until now. Officer Ray Mallory, the issuing official behind the original citation. He was seated stiffly, shoulders squared with that familiar posture of municipal confidence, the kind that rarely expected challenge and almost never faced it under oath. His uniform was crisp, badge polished, posture perfect. He was supposed to be a supporting character in this hearing, there to recite a claim, nod to the bench, and retreat into paperwork and procedure. But Karoline had plans for him. She approached with deliberate care, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, her eyes steady. She stopped just short of the witness box, flipping open her folder with a quiet, decisive click that echoed louder than it had any right to in the taut silence of the courtroom. Every movement was intentional. Every second measured. "Officer Mallory," she began, her voice smooth but edged with clarity. "You issued the citation that led to this fine, correct?" The officer nodded, his tone clipped. "Yes, ma'am." His voice carried that practiced cadence, precise, dry, and rehearsed. It was the kind of tone used when expecting compliance, not inquiry. Karoline gave a faint nod, the kind that welcomed more without giving anything away. "And what was the basis for that citation?" He didn't flinch. "Violation of Municipal Code 48B-2, he answered. "Improper signage size and placement. Clearly over the limit." There was confidence there, perhaps too much. His answer came fast, like a line he'd said dozens of times before, embedded not just in memory, but muscle. But Karoline didn't challenge him, not yet. She merely nodded again, allowing the silence to cushion the weight of his words before stepping closer. "You included photographs with the citation?" Mallory hesitated, just briefly. It was enough. "No," he said. "Didn't have the camera on me at the time." Karoline raised her eyebrows slightly, but not in disbelief. "In documentation." "Measurement tools?" He looked momentarily thrown by the simplicity of the question. "No, ma'am," he replied again. "I've been on this job 22 years. I know when something's out of code." There it was, the cornerstone, the unspoken doctrine, experience as evidence. She nodded slowly. "So, the citation was based entirely on your visual assessment at the time?" "Yes." Her tone didn't shift. Her pace didn't quicken. She just moved the pieces into place like an attorney setting up an inevitability, not an argument. "No documentation," she said. "No timestamp, no physical measurement." "Correct," he confirmed, a little firmer this time, as though certainty might fill in the absence of proof. Karoline stood still, hands gently resting on the folder. Her eyes locked on the officer with the kind of composure that doesn't demand attention. It earns it. Then she stepped in. Not with a yell, not with a raised hand or a pounding fist. Just one sentence, dropped like a pin into a room full of loaded silence. "That's not enforcement," she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "That's interpretation." The gallery didn't gasp. It didn't have to. The energy in the room shifted instantly, like someone had opened a window in a space too long sealed shut. There was no visible reaction from the crowd, but you could feel it. Backs straightening, eyes sharpening, thoughts aligning. Karoline hadn't delivered a rebuttal. She delivered a diagnosis. Mallory opened his mouth, then hesitated. The first crack. His certainty wavered, not visibly, but internally. Because she hadn't attacked his integrity. She hadn't accused him of lying. She hadn't needed to. She had simply laid bare the structure he operated within, and showed the court that it had no foundation beneath it. She turned toward the bench, not looking for validation, but locking eyes with Barrett as if inviting him to contradict her. A fine base solely on an officer's perception without measurement, documentation, or record, she said slowly, isn't an act of law. It's an act of assumption. Barrett's face didn't move, but something behind it did. His mouth didn't open, but his silence deepened. Not the silence of consideration, but the silence of erosion. Authority shifting by degrees beneath his robe. Karoline continued forward, not walking, but expanding. Every word becoming structure. Every phrase building something that couldn't be unspoken. When law enforcement acts on instinct, she said, they are trained to back it with process, evidence, review. That's the safeguard. That's the line between judgment and justice. She turned again toward the officer, her voice firm, but never raised. "Officer Mallory, did you verify the signage dimensions against the city's posted code before issuing the citation?" Mallory hesitated longer this time. "No, ma'am," he finally said. "Didn't need to. It was obviously too large." "Obviously," Karoline repeated, letting the word roll off her tongue like a test of its weight. "According to what measurement?" Mallory shifted in his seat, opened his mouth, then shut it again. No answer. She let that silence stretch, to the gallery, to the record, to the bench. She didn't fill it with commentary. She didn't need to. The absence of a response was the response. Then turned back to Barrett, who now sat not with authority, but with apprehension. This court accepted a $15,000 penalty based on a guess, on a visual instinct, on what felt like a violation. Her voice narrowed, sharpened. That is not due process. That is not law. That is not enforcement. Another pause. She took a single step forward. That is interpretation. And the weight of it dropped again. Not just on Barrett, on the courtroom, on the system. Because for the first time, someone had drawn a line so clearly in the sand that the people watching could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Enforcement demands evidence. Interpretation demands trust. And one of those things has no place on its own in a courtroom. Barrett blinked, once, hard, as if trying to reset the moment. But it was too late. Karoline hadn't just questioned the foundation of the case. She had named its collapse in real time. And now the rubble sat at their feet, undeniable, unfixable. What was supposed to be a routine fine had become something else entirely. A referendum. And the verdict wasn't waiting. It was already happening. The word interpretation still hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Karoline had spoken it without force, without malice, but with the kind of finality that didn't require volume to echo. And echo it did. Through the wooden beams of courtroom 4B, through the still hands of the gallery, through the throat of the clerk who, for the first time that day, forgot to breathe. Judge Barrett hadn't spoken since. Not out of reflection, out of recognition. Because something had shifted, and everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. And worst of all for him, everyone was still watching. For most of his career, Judge Alan Barrett had worn authority like armor. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to explain. His control wasn't questioned because no one ever made it far enough to challenge him with something more powerful than presence. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't just present. She was prepared. And now, as her argument cut deeper, his armor had begun to rattle. His right thumb tapped the gavel's base, not quickly, not rhythmically, just enough to be noticed by those looking for the sound of unraveling. Karoline was. She stood behind her folder like it was a podium, not a stack of paper. Her voice rested for now, but her eyes didn't waver. She wasn't watching a man anymore. She was watching a mask, one that had started to slip. Barrett shifted in his chair. It wasn't much, just a lean back, a slight adjustment of his robe at the shoulder. But in a courtroom where every gesture carries weight, it was enough to register. Enough to betray what his words hadn't yet confessed. He was losing control. Not of the room, of the illusion. Karoline waited. Let the silence fill the gaps his authority used to occupy. No rush, no follow-up. Because she knew the most powerful sound in a courtroom isn't a voice, it's hesitation. And Barrett was wrapped in it. Not in reflection, not in measured authority. In something colder, heavier. It clung to him like a wet robe, unseen but suffocating. The silence around him wasn't obedient anymore. It was observant, pressing. The kind of silence that doesn't wait for instruction. It watches for cracks. He reached for the water glass beside him, hands steady enough to suggest calm, but slow enough to betray thought. His fingers trembled just slightly at the tips, not enough for most to notice, but enough for the clerk to pause mid-note, enough for Ashcroft's eyes to narrow, just briefly. He didn't sip, he just held the glass, like it could anchor him to the moment. Like if he focused hard enough on the condensation sliding down its side, he could unhear what had just been laid before him. His other hand hovered near the gavel but didn't touch it. Not because he didn't want to, because he knew if he did, the room would hear the desperation in the wood. His breathing had changed. No longer even. Now shallow, measured in quiet gulps, as though drawing breath from a courtroom that no longer gave it freely. The robe that once felt like armor now felt like heat. You could see it in his shoulders, in the way he sat straighter not from confidence but necessity, trying to hold a posture that had been earned through habit, not merit. And his eyes. They were no longer scanning the room with that bored judicial detachment. Now, they darted. To the prosecutor. To the clerk. Even, for a fleeting second, to the gallery. Looking for an ally, finding none. Because this wasn't about a fine anymore. This wasn't about signage or municipal codes. This wasn't about procedural discretion. This was about what happens when a judge who's ruled by inertia is finally forced to explain himself, on the record, under scrutiny, and in front of a voice that refused to disappear. And there, in the stillest moment of the trial, as his fingers gripped a sweating glass and his voice hid behind silence, Alan Barrett understood. He was no longer presiding. He was being watched. Karoline didn't give him the out. She stepped forward, slow and sure, the sound of her heels sharp but not aggressive. "Your Honor," she said, and it wasn't a plea. It was a reckoning. "I would like the officer's testimony struck from the record on the basis of it being wholly unsupported by evidence and devoid of verifiable fact. And I am also requesting, formally, that this court articulate the standard of proof it relied upon to accept his judgment as enforceable." The request wasn't just legal, it was devastating. Because now Barrett had two choices: explain the ruling and expose its hollowness, or dodge and confirm everything Karoline had already implied. He set the glass down, harder than necessary. The sound echoed once sharply, then was swallowed by silence. "The court is not required to meet your personal satisfaction, Miss Leavitt," he said finally, the tone clipped, colder than before, but missing something essential: conviction. She didn't blink. "It is, however, required to meet constitutional standards, which, respectfully, are not mine. They belong to everyone in this room." The gallery leaned in, almost as one, not with outrage, with awakening. Karoline hadn't just built a case. She had peeled back the face of a court too long unchallenged. And beneath the robe, beneath the posture and the routines and the authority that used to silence dissent, they were finally seeing what had always been there. A man, not a pillar, not a principle. A man. And that man was starting to sweat. It was barely visible. A slight sheen at the temple. A twitch near the eye. The kind of details most wouldn't catch. But Karoline had prosecuted men who lied under oath. Men who played with power and thought precision couldn't touch them. She knew the signs of fear disguised as firmness. She saw it now. Barrett cleared his throat, reached for the gavel again. This time he lifted it, but didn't strike. Because a gavel only works when it ends something. And Karoline had made it clear. Nothing was over. Not until the law answered for itself. "I will take your objection under advisement," he muttered, the words flat, dismissive, but paper thin. She nodded once, as if to say, "Good. Let's see how far you can advise yourself out of this." Because she wasn't going anywhere. Not until he either acknowledged what had happened in that courtroom or got buried under the weight of pretending it hadn't. And now, for the first time in his long career, Judge Barrett wasn't looking at a defendant. He was looking at consequence. And he knew it. Barrett's voice trailed off into a silence that no longer obeyed him. It didn't fill the room with authority. It lingered like smoke after a fire. Thin, acrid, exposed. Karoline stood without moving, her posture unshaken, but not still. There was energy pulsing around her now, not bravado, not defiance, something quieter, heavier. The sense that she had shifted the weight of the room without lifting anything but the truth. And it was that shift, slow, irreversible, that cracked open the next moment. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Not the usual shuffle of a late spectator, not the soft footfall of an intern, returning from a document run. This sound carried presence, authority, finality. Every head in the gallery turned, first with curiosity, then with tension. Even the clerk froze mid-scribble. Her pen, which had finally regained its rhythm after Karoline's last statement, halted in midair like it had been caught in a lie. A figure entered, tall and deliberate. Black robe, silver hair. Steps that didn't hurry but never hesitated. The courtroom didn't recognize him immediately. Not the junior attorneys, not the clerks, not even the prosecutor, until he stood beside the bench and removed his glasses with the same steady composure with which one might defuse a bomb. Judge Franklin Ashcroft, senior federal observer, retired from the appellate court but often summoned for internal review, particularly in cases where a courtroom's integrity had been publicly questioned or internally compromised. He hadn't been invited, but he was there. Barrett's eyes narrowed, not in confusion, but in recognition. A muscle in his jaw jumped, betraying what the rest of his face tried to suppress. He didn't stand. He didn't welcome him. But his posture straightened, as if trying to mask the alarm that had just swept in under the courtroom door like a storm front. Karoline didn't blink, because she knew exactly what this was. Oversight, unannounced, unignorable. Barrett tried to speak, but Ashcroft raised a hand, not rudely, not forcefully, just enough to reclaim the room. "I'll be observing," he said simply, his voice smooth but lined with years of knowing when something had gone off script. "Proceed as planned." But the message was clear. Nothing was proceeding as planned, because plans don't include reinforcements unless something's already burning. Barrett gave the barest nod. His voice, when it returned, was tight. "As you wish. You?" Ashcroft didn't sit in the jury box, or at the bench, or anywhere that suggested a need for permission. He stood, arms folded, eyes steady, at the far right side of the courtroom. Far enough not to obstruct, close enough not to miss a single detail. The entire room shifted, not with sound, with awareness. The clerk's pen resumed, this time with urgency. The prosecutor sat straighter, his hands now clasped tightly, lips pressed thin. Even Officer Mallory, who had been deflating slowly since Karoline's last round of questions, turned slightly in his chair like he'd just realized the stakes had gone from civil hearing to high-stakes audit. And Barrett? He breathed differently now, shallow, calculated, because this wasn't his courtroom anymore. Not completely. Karoline allowed a beat of silence to stretch before speaking again. Not to Ashcroft, not yet. Her focus remained on Barrett, but her voice shifted, sharper, polished with the kind of tone that knew what was happening and didn't need to gloat about it. "For the record," she said, "I welcome the oversight. It's overdue." Barrett's gavel hand twitched, but he didn't lift it, not with Ashcroft watching, because now every word, every pause, every decision was under a microscope, one that couldn't be dismissed, ignored, or intimidated. Karoline turned back to her folder, unfastened a fresh sheet. She was still holding court, but now the court was listening for a different reason. Accountability had entered the room, uninvited, unapologetic. Barrett leaned forward, elbows on the bench like a man trying to reclaim posture when authority is no longer enough. "Miss Leavitt," he said, quieter now, "you may proceed." He didn't say it like a command. He said it like surrender. Because once oversight steps in, discretion becomes memory. The game changes. The weight of your words starts getting recorded not just for the record, but for review. And Barrett, for all his years behind that bench, knew what that meant. Karoline nodded once. No smile, no flash of triumph, just confirmation. And as she began her next sentence, something fundamental had shifted. Not in her, in the system. Because the moment Ashcroft walked through those doors, the courtroom remembered that justice doesn't answer only to power. Sometimes, it answers to someone watching. Karoline didn't look at Judge Ashcroft as she resumed. She didn't need to. His presence wasn't validation, it was confirmation. The system had finally turned inward, and now, for the first time, it was watching itself. She turned another page in her folder. Clean, deliberate, no rush. Her hand rested at the edge of the paper for a second longer than necessary, allowing the tension in the room to do what Barrett's gavel could no longer manage. Hold the room still. Your Honor, she said, her voice even. What we're dealing with here is not a misstep. It's not an isolated error in enforcement. It's a pattern, a method, a structure built not on proof, but on presumption. Barrett didn't respond. He didn't even shift. But the stillness in his body wasn't confidence anymore. It was survival. The kind of stillness a man practices when the cracks beneath him are getting wider, and any movement risks a fall. Karoline continued. This courtroom has operated under the assumption that officer interpretation is equivalent to evidence. That visual judgment, unaccompanied by documentation or objective metrics, is enough to justify a financial penalty. She turned to the gallery, not for performance, but to ensure the statement landed where it was meant to, in the minds of every observer now realizing they weren't just watching a case. They were witnessing a confession of design. But what happens when that assumption becomes practice? When it becomes policy? When hundreds, maybe thousands of fines are issued not because of verified facts, but because a single individual claimed they knew what they saw? Her eyes flicked back to Barrett, the way a lens sharpens before a final exposure. I'll tell you what happens, she said. You create a machine, one that punishes without record, penalizes without review, and functions in silence because no one expects it to be questioned. The court reporter paused for a split second before catching up, fingers tapping like they were chasing something they hadn't anticipated would move this fast. Karoline stepped once to the left, drawing a subtle line between herself and the bench. It wasn't symbolic, it was strategic. She was physically separating the voice of accountability from the body that had tried to suppress it. I have in this folder, she said, lifting a thin sheaf of papers, 3 additional citations issued under Code 48B2 within the last month. All by the same officer, all lacking photo evidence, no timestamps, no third-party confirmation. She laid them down flat, one by one, and all resulted in fines between $10,000 and $15,000. Barrett stared forward, eyes narrowing, not in judgment, in calculation. He was assessing risk now, not legal standing. Because Karoline hadn't just come to fight her own citation. She had come to expose the mechanism that had issued hundreds just like it. This is not a courtroom lapse, she said. This is systemic. It is engineered, and it is profitable. Ashcroft's gaze was locked on her now, hands folded lightly in front of him. He didn't speak, didn't nod. But his silence wasn't passive. It was listening. He wasn't overseeing anymore. He was absorbing. Karoline turned again to the gallery, her voice slowing. Every person fined under this system was told they'd violated a code. But they were never shown the proof, because there wasn't any. They were told to appeal, quietly, to pay, quickly, and to move on, compliantly. She looked back to Barrett. I didn't move on, and now we all see what's behind the curtain. The gallery was utterly still. No coughs, no whispers, no motion. Just the raw, collective stillness of realization. People weren't just watching a hearing anymore. They were watching the fragile scaffolding of unchecked power buckle under the weight of truth. Karoline placed the last document from her folder on the table, then stepped back. This is no longer about whether I exceeded a signage limit. This is about whether this court, this system, has been functioning as a gatekeeper of justice or as an engine of punishment. Barrett said nothing. Because what could he say? If he pushed back now, he'd look reactive. If he remained silent, he confirmed her every word. And if he tried to gavel her down, with Ashcroft watching, he'd declare open war against oversight. Karoline had done what most never attempt. She hadn't just defended herself. She'd turned a courtroom into a mirror. And now the system was being forced to look at its own reflection. Not the polished, ceremonial version dressed in robes and gavels and Latin phrases, but the one that finds without evidence, enforces without question, and punishes without accountability. And for the first time in that courtroom's history, it was being forced to answer for itself. Karoline stood motionless for a long second after her last words landed, letting the room breathe in the silence she had just sculpted. It was no longer stillness for tension. It was stillness for absorption. Every face in the gallery, every eye in the room was trained on her now. Not as a defendant, not as a legal mind on trial, but as something heavier, something rarer. A witness who refused to shut the door behind her. She looked down at the table in front of her hand resting gently on a second folder. Not the one containing legal precedent. Not the one packed with municipal code violations and statutes. This one was heavier, not in weight, but in consequence. She opened it, slowly. "These aren't hypotheticals," she said softly, her voice now absent of edge, just pure, leveled gravity. "What happened to me today? It's not new, it's not rare, it's a pattern." She pulled out the first page and held it with both hands. James Holloway, 54 years old, former warehouse foreman from Newark, New Jersey. He was fined $9,200 for improper residential storage because a city inspector claimed his work van was parked too close to a fire hydrant. No photo, no measuring tape, just a handwritten citation issued on a drive-by. She placed the sheet down in front of her. He asked to appeal. The city said he'd missed the deadline because the citation had been mailed to the wrong address. By the time he got the notice, a lien had already been placed on his home. The room barely stirred, but a sharp breath could be heard from somewhere in the gallery. Karoline's voice didn't waver. Within 6 months, he lost the house, couldn't afford the penalty, the legal fees, and his mortgage. And the inspector who issued the ticket? She looked straight at Barrett. Never even had to explain why there was no documentation. The city called it an administrative oversight. She let the silence stretch for just a beat longer, then drew out the next sheet. Clarice Moreno, a single mother in San Antonio. She ran a daycare out of her home. Every child in her care had signed parental waivers. Every inspection passed. But one day, she was hit with a $12,000 fine for allegedly running an unlicensed group care facility. Karoline paused. There was no investigation, no hearing, just a notice on her door and a frozen bank account. When she tried to contest it, she was told the enforcement officer's statement was sufficient to sustain the penalty. Another page lay gently on the table. She lost the daycare. And when she went to file a formal appeal, she was told the documents had been shredded due to routine file maintenance. Her voice had changed again. Not louder, but sharper now, each word dressed in restraint, but carrying a storm behind the syllables. And then there's Arjun Desai, retired mechanical engineer. Bought a corner lot in Jacksonville and turned it into a community garden for his neighborhood. Funded it himself. No donations, just an idea. She held up the final document. Not like evidence, but like an obituary. He was fined $7,600 for unauthorized land use. The complaint was issued by a city compliance officer who said the garden exceeded the zoning for recreational space. No map, no inspection record, no neighbor complaints, just a box checked on a clipboard. Karoline set the last page down, her hand hovering over it for a moment like she couldn't quite let go of the weight. He wrote 5 letters asking for a hearing. All 5 went unanswered. She looked up. Her voice was quieter now, but it was unbearable in its calm. 3 stories, 3 different cities, 3 people whose lives were altered, in some cases destroyed, by a process that no longer asks for evidence, just obedience. Her eyes scanned the room. And if I hadn't stood here today with a law degree, with knowledge of procedure and precedent, with the ability to speak loud enough and long enough to hold this courtroom still, my story would have ended the same way. She turned toward Judge Barrett, but her tone wasn't accusatory now. It was surgical, truth-wearing armor. This system doesn't need to scream to crush someone. It doesn't need to arrest or detain. It just needs a signature on a fine, a box on a form, a stamp that says penalty enforced, and a citizen who doesn't know how to fight it. Barrett didn't blink, didn't nod, didn't flinch. But Karoline saw the shift again, small, hidden, like a man realizing too late that the ground he'd been standing on was never as firm as he believed. She turned slightly toward Ashcroft now, not to ask for backup, but because accountability should always be looking itself in the eye. "This isn't about a mistake," she said. "This is about machinery, about bureaucracy weaponized through silence. It's about courts that no longer ask why before they punish." She stepped back from the table, her hands finally still. And today, it stops being invisible. No one clapped. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Because Karoline Leavitt had done more than tell 3 stories. She had connected the dots. And what stood between them was a single, blinding truth. This wasn't justice. It was a system. And it was watching itself unravel, one unshakable voice at a time. For a long moment there was nothing. No voices, no movement. The air inside courtroom 4B had turned to glass, brittle, transparent, dangerously still. Every eye was fixed on Karoline, and every breath held tight, as if waiting for gravity to decide which way it would tilt next. The stories she had laid bare didn't float. They hung, heavy and unrelenting, their weight pressing down on every corner of the room. No one could pretend they hadn't heard them. No one could unsee the thread she'd pulled through every page of every citation, tying them together into one unbroken indictment. Judge Barrett had not spoken since the final story, not because he hadn't wanted to, but because he couldn't find a place to start. For the first time in his career, the courtroom he had mastered no longer moved at his command. And worse, it didn't fear him. His authority, once upheld by silence and precedent, now sat in judgment, under the same scrutiny he had grown used to directing at others. Karoline remained standing. She hadn't shifted her posture, hadn't touched her folder again, hadn't adjusted a strand of hair. Still, present, entire. Her restraint wasn't a tactic. It was an indictment of its own. One that said everything that needed to be said had already been placed on the record, and now the system would either correct itself or reveal, for everyone to see, that it had no intention of doing so. Barrett's fingers touched the edge of the gavel, but he didn't raise it. His eyes flicked toward Ashcroft, the senior judge who had entered like a shadow and stayed like a storm cloud. Ashcroft didn't move. He didn't speak. His presence was no longer a threat. It was a wall. Barrett couldn't lean past it, couldn't sidestep it, because everyone in the room, including himself, knew what it meant for a federal-level observer to remain that still, that attentive, that unreadable. It meant nothing said next could be walked back. Barrett adjusted in his chair. Then finally, with a throat cleared too many times, and a voice suddenly aware of how much attention it didn't deserve, he spoke. "This court," he began slowly, stiffly, "has reviewed the arguments presented by Miss Leavitt, including the cited cases, the supporting documentation, and the constitutional concerns raised." The courtroom remained silent. But it wasn't quiet. It vibrated with a pulse. Faint, collective, internal. Everyone breathing as one, but refusing to move until the sentence landed. Barrett's jaw tensed. "There is," he said carefully, "insufficient evidentiary support for the citation issued under Municipal Code 48B2. The testimony offered by the enforcement officer lacks verifiable data, corroboration, or documentation." He paused. And in that pause, every heartbeat in the room synced. "The fine," he continued, "is hereby vacated. The ruling is dismissed. The citation is nullified and shall be expunged from the record." He didn't drop the gavel. He didn't look at Karoline. He just sat back, as if hoping the statement would dissolve into the walls before anyone realized what it truly meant. But Karoline knew. This wasn't a declaration of justice. It was a retreat. A quiet, clumsy undoing of a decision that never should have been made. Not because it was proven wrong, but because it had never been right. Barrett hadn't reversed course out of fairness. He'd backed away from a cliff he hadn't realized he'd been standing on until the ground gave out beneath him. Ashcroft remained silent, but his eyes didn't leave Barrett. And that silence was its own verdict. Karoline didn't react. No smile, no breath of relief, no triumphant glance toward the gallery. Because this moment, this courtroom admission that the fine had no foundation, was not a personal win. It was a temporary correction in a system still designed to bury those who couldn't stand where she had stood. She lowered her hands to the edge of the defense table, rested them flat, and then, finally, slowly, she sat. Not in exhaustion, but in finality. The room remained locked in that strange, vibrating quiet, like the air hadn't yet caught up with what had just happened. And then, one by one, the shift began. The clerk's pen began to move again, scribbling not just a dismissal, but history. The court reporter's fingers resumed their rapid-fire rhythm, though now with a pace that suggested they were chronicling more than just legal outcome. And in the gallery, a woman in the second row, mid-30s, hands clasped tightly in her lap, exhaled a shaky breath like she'd been holding it for someone else. Karoline turned her head ever so slightly, just enough to take in the faces now staring back at her. Some wide-eyed, some furrowed in thought, others blinking like they had just seen something that might change the way they walked into courtrooms for the rest of their lives. And maybe they had. She collected her folder. Not quickly, not reverently, just with care. As if what it now held wasn't just paperwork, but evidence that systems could be forced to look at themselves and change. Judge Barrett didn't say another word. His voice had done enough damage for one day. And now it was clear. He wasn't in control of this courtroom anymore. Not in practice, not in perception. He had retreated. And Karoline? She didn't pursue. Because this was never about vengeance. It was about the record. And now, the record bore her imprint. As she rose from her seat, the courtroom didn't erupt. No one clapped. There was no cathartic cheer. Just a quiet understanding that something important had happened, and that the echoes would stretch far beyond the room. Ashcroft finally turned, folding his hands behind his back, eyes calm. He didn't acknowledge Barrett. He didn't need to. His presence had already delivered the message. "We saw what you did." Karoline walked toward the exit. Each step was measured, each movement purposeful. Her heels struck the marble floor like punctuation marks at the end of a ruling that hadn't come from the bench, but from the truth. And the truth had won. Not because the court wanted it to, but because it had no choice. Outside, the sun had started to fall lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. She paused at the top, just for a moment, folder in hand, breath steady. She didn't look back, because the point had never been to bask in the aftermath. The point was to make sure no one else had to fight this hard just to be heard. She descended the steps with that same silent grace that had filled the courtroom hours earlier. And with every step, the message echoed louder. This wasn't about a fine. This was about setting the country back on track, one ruling at a time. The courthouse door closed behind her with a hush, not a slam. No roaring applause, no media swarm, no flashing cameras chasing a hero's silhouette down the steps. Just sunlight, wind, and the steady rhythm of her heels on concrete, punctuating a silence that, for once, felt earned. Karoline didn't pause for attention. She didn't wave. She didn't need to. Because this wasn't about optics. This wasn't about headlines. This was about the long, quiet work of holding a system to its own promises. Inside that courtroom, she hadn't just dismantled a baseless fine. She hadn't just forced a judge to retreat from the very authority he once wielded like a weapon. She had shown what accountability looks like in real time. She had forced a centuries-old machine to look at itself and blink. And maybe, just maybe, recalibrate. But Karoline didn't celebrate. Because the stories she carried in her folder, the man who lost his home, the woman whose business was erased, the gardener fined for growing life on borrowed land. Those stories didn't end with a gavel strike or a line through a case number. They were still happening. In other towns, in other courtrooms, under other judges who hadn't yet been challenged. This wasn't the end of something. This was the beginning. A beginning built not on outrage but on record, not on spectacle, but on precedent. Because the next time someone walks into a courtroom with nothing but a folder, a voice, and a refusal to be dismissed, there will be a blueprint waiting for them. A line of cases, a transcript, a record of what happened when someone said, "No more," and someone listened. Maybe not right away, maybe not willingly, but they listened. And the law, once twisted and weaponized, had to answer to itself. And in that moment, as Karoline stepped into the light beyond the courthouse doors, she understood something deeper than victory. That this wasn't just about striking down a fine or correcting one ruling. It was about cracking open a system that too often operated in silence and making space for truth to speak. And in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it, from the gallery to the streets beyond, that truth echoed. Justice isn't loud, but it is unstoppable when someone dares to carry it forward. This wasn't just a courtroom win. It was the beginning of something bigger. A door once guarded, now pushed ajar, for everyone still waiting on the other side. Thank you for watching. I'm curious. Where are you listening from today? Drop your location in the comments below. If this story about courage, accountability, and the power of one voice standing against many moved you, please hit that like button so it reaches others who need to hear it. And don't miss the next video appearing on your screen. It's another powerful story that will leave you inspired. Remember, sometimes the strongest force in the room isn't power. It's truth, spoken without fear.